Well, hello all. I want to talk today about the Feast of Debris Shelters. You may have heard of it as the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. And I'm sure you're thinking that's got absolutely nothing to do with me. Hasn't that got something to do with the Jews in the Old Testament? Well, the whole Old Testament is not for the Jews. It is for everyone, the people of God. Do you think Genesis was just for the Jews? Do you think that Psalms is just for the Jews? Don't you like your Psalm 91 protection psalm? So why do you think that the whole Old Testament you can just, oh, that was for somebody else? No, it's for you. So the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Debris Shelters, which is the most correct interpretation of the word, because in Leviticus 23 and in Nehemiah, it talks about how the people of God were commanded to take branches from trees and as a way of showing their appreciation to God for what He'd done for them during the year at the end of the harvest, they were to go and build these debris shelters and live in them for 7 days and celebrate and thank the Lord for the good that He'd done. Now, why should we thank the Lord for the good that He's done? Well, I don't know about you, but I get the feeling that the world has just become a lot more malevolent. It used to be a benevolent world up to about 2020, then the COVID struck, and now we're seeing the effects of global warming. Mr. Putin is got a little itchy finger over that little red button that he wants to start a nuclear war. We all know people who've died of COVID. You know, death is like, oh, it's become almost like common. And we are warned that COVID's not the last epidemic that there's going to be. Maybe it's just the first. So even the economy just seems to be struggling along, struggling. I'm saying there's just a feeling that the world has just become a far less pleasant place. Now, I want you to have a look at Deuteronomy 28, verse 47, which says, "Because you serve not the Lord thy God with joyfulness and with gladness of heart for the abundance of all things." So we lived in a world of abundance of all things up to, I would have said, around about 2020. "Therefore," Deuteronomy 28:48, "shall you serve your enemies which the Lord shall send against you in hunger and in thirst and in nakedness and in want of all things, and he shall put a yoke of iron upon your neck until he have destroyed thee." So you might say, well, what's this got to do with the Feast of Debris Shelters? Well, God tells us how to serve the Lord with joyfulness, and that is, He tells us there's a feast called the Feast of Booths. He tells us how to keep it, and where to keep it, and when to keep it. Now, if you want to know how to keep it, and I say that we can, instead of us saying, well, how do we thank the Lord for the abundance of all things? Why don't we just take the way He tells us to thank Him for the abundance of all things? And it sounds like a ridiculous idea to some. I think it's a wonderful idea. I mean, you know me, I don't need any excuse to build a debris shelter. I've spent the whole year showing you YouTube videos of building debris shelters. I think it's a whole lot of fun. And I'm going to show you in a moment, I think, how the simplest debris shelter should be built. But do you know that nobody kept this feast? The Jews, for whom you say it's their feast, nobody actually kept it till they, yes, came under the power of their enemies. They were taken into Babylon for 70 years, the Jews, the Israelites. Nobody kept it during the time of the judges. Nobody kept it during the time of the kings. And only after they came back out of the captivity in Babylon, that 70-year captivity under Nebuchadnezzar, did the Jews under Nehemiah and Ezra begin to keep the Feast of Debris Shelters. And this is what they found. This is how they described they did it in Nehemiah 8:14. "And they found written in the law which the Lord had commanded by Moses, that the children of Israel should dwell in booths in the feast of the 7 months. And they should publish and proclaim in all their cities and in Jerusalem, saying, Go forth unto the mount, and fetch olive branches, and pine branches, and myrtle branches, and palm branches, and branches of thick trees, to make booths, as it is written. So these branches aren't for waving, they're for making debris shelters out of the branches. Nehemiah 8:16. So the people went forth and brought them and made themselves booths, everyone upon the roof of their house. Remember, they had flat roofs, and in their courts or courtyards, and in the courts of the house of God, and in the streets of the water gate, and in the streets of the gate of Ephraim. So they made these debris shelters all around the place, anywhere they could find a flat place outside. So this is not inside your living room or on I suppose you're supposed to find a place outside and make it. And all the congregation of them that would come again out of the captivity made booths and sat under the booths, for since the days of Joshua the son of Nun, unto that day had not the children of Israel done so, and there was very great gladness. So even from the day of Joshua, after they'd come into the promised land, they hadn't kept this feast the way it was commanded. David never kept it. Solomon never kept it. All the kings of Israel never kept it. So you say, these are the feasts of the Jews, but the Jews never kept it. These are feasts actually for us, the people of God. Everything that went to the Jews first was meant to go to Gentiles. So you could say, well, Christ, when he came to earth, he took his stuff only to the Jews. He was reluctant even to heal a Gentile woman, but he did so because he knew that things must first be offered to the Jews, and then it gets spread out to everybody else, the Gentiles. And so it has happened that the gospel went out to the world. And do you know what? Christ was killed on a Jewish holiday. He was killed on Passover. It's a day of great importance to Christians. Do you know that the Christian church began on the day of Pentecost? Yes, on the day of Pentecost, a so-called Jewish holiday, the Christian church began. And all the disciples, including Christ, kept these feasts. So where do we get the idea that these are just feasts for the Jews? Now, let me give you a prophecy in Zechariah 14, verse 16. It's talking about the time after Christ's return, and it says in Zechariah 14:16, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is left of all the nations which came up against Jerusalem, this is at the Armageddon, shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This Feast of Debris Shelters, the Feast of Tabernacles. Gentile nations are going to all come up to Jerusalem when Christ is there to keep this so-called Jewish feast. No, it's a feast for everybody. Now we, the people of God, Christians, it's a feast for us. When the whole world is being converted and coming to Christ, and when he sits in Jerusalem as king, they're going to come to him to keep the feast there. But now Christ is in us. We are the tabernacle. We are the temple of God. We are scattered throughout the world. We are not in Jerusalem. And do you think that the Jews and people don't keep holy days simply because they don't live in Jerusalem? No, we keep holy days. We keep sacred days. So I'm saying that around the world, people are going to be commanded to keep these so-called Jewish holidays. No. Zechariah 14:18 continues, and if the family of Egypt go not up, say they refuse to go up, and come not, that have no rain, there shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. So God is going to smite with a plague people who refuse to keep the Feast of Tabernacles in the future. So I get back to that thought that we're living in a malevolent world now. It's a world where a switch seems to have been flipped, and all the things that were just so easy and pleasant and you took for granted, good weather, good health, good finances, blessings, no war since basically the Second World War, no World War. Now we're looking at global warming and possible nuclear war and possible financial meltdown and all kinds of health problems and overcrowding and no jobs and you name it. So I say And I'm not like these preachers who can promise, oh, God's going to bless you, this, that, and the other. But I do say that if God tells us to rejoice at what he's done for us, and he tells us the means of rejoicing, which is to keep the Feast of Debris shelters, then why not do it? I mean, how hard is it to? Let's show you how to make a simple debris shelter. So let's suppose here is a palm tree. And it's got all these palm leaves, or it's just any old tree. I suggest, if you're a newbie to debris shelters, that the simplest thing is to cut yourself 3 palm branches, like this. You put 2 together, and the 3rd palm branch you lay it like this. This is how I'm planning to make one of my debris shelters. And I'm actually planning to have a Feast of Debris shelters from the 10th of October, the evening of the 10th of October, or the day of the 11th of October, but it starts at sunset. That's the night of the full moon after the equinox. So that is when you're supposed to keep the Feast of Debris shelters, on the first full moon after the night, after the equinox. And you will find on the 10th of October is the night when the moon is 100% full. There are tables which tell you the fullness of the moon in your area, and you want the moon to rise after sunset. So you look up the sunset time, you look up the moonrise time, you look for when the moon is rising after sunset, and that will be the day of the full moon. So, and then you're going to put your sleeping bag here. And there's going to be you lying on your pillow, and there's going to be sleeping under, and here's going to be the full moon. And I always like to climb onto a high place and watch the moon rise, and this year I plan to, hopefully there'll be no cloud and it'll be no rain, and I plan to do time lapse of the moon rising above the mountains just after sunset. So in my area, the sun sets at 6:42, and the moon rises at 7. I think it's 38. But it'll have to rise above the mountains before I see it. There's me sleeping in my sleeping bag. And enjoying the beautiful full moon. I might have a little fire or something like that. Let's see if we can find some yellow chalk somewhere for a fire. Don't see my yellow chalk. Nope. We're just going to have the green fire. So we'll have a little fire here. And we're going to cook and enjoy ourselves. So, that is, I'm inviting you to rejoice and serve the Lord with joyfulness and with gladness of heart for the abundance of all things. Imagine how much fun it is for the whole family, you and your kids, to build yourself a little booth, say 3 branches like this. You just lash them, and then you wind the one branch around till it gets tight. And then, frankly, if you've got more branches, you can also just lay them like this. And if it rains, if it's threatening rain, then just get a piece of plastic and drape it over here, and then put the branches on top. I like to get clear plastic. This black DPC plastic, it works fantastically, but I find it a little bit depressing to be covered with black. I like to be able to see out. And then to sleep under your booth and eat around or under your booth, in the shade of your booth. And that is how God commanded people to rejoice. And I do believe that God blesses us as we do our best to obey Him. And like I say, the Bible, the whole Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, was written And it was first given to the Jews, but it was given to everybody after that. It was first offered to the Jews. Remember, the Israelite nation was just like a little test case that God was just trying out, blessing them first, but then the blessing spread to them and the rest of the world. So from the formation of the church on a holy day, which is Pentecost, the blessing spread to everybody, and everybody should be keeping these feasts that are mentioned in Leviticus 23. I'll just mention to you what it says in Leviticus 23, verse 34. Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of the 7th month. Now, the 15th day means the middle of the month, which means the full moon, because months begin with a new moon, and 15 days later is the full moon. So on the 15th day of the month, of the 7th month, which happens to be September, October, whichever it comes after the equinox, shall be the Feast of Tabernacles, or debris shelters, for 7 days unto the Lord. And he shall take you on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, and the boughs of thick trees, and the willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. And you shall keep it a feast unto the Lord 7 days in the year, and it shall be a statute forever in your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths 7 days. So, what was started with the Jews was intended for everybody to enjoy, as we see in Zechariah 14, that eventually around the world, as Christ's message spreads and as people subject themselves to him, as he lives, as he rules from Jerusalem, that all the Gentile nations are going to keep this feast. So do you think that God never intended the Gentile nations to keep the feast? Do you think he never intended for Christians to keep feasts? You know, Christians make up feasts like Christmas and Easter. They don't know that God has already given feasts like Passover and the Feast of Debris Shelters or Tabernacles. God has given these feasts. We don't have to make up feasts. We don't have to make up ways of rejoicing and worshiping the Lord. And God appreciates us giving him our 7 days of our time to sleep under these booths. And you may think it's strange, why, when you're blessed with all your food, and why rejoice in this way? Well, that's the way God suggested it. And that sounds like a fun thing. You don't have to twist my arm to get me to live in a debris shelter for 7 days. In your garden, if you have a flat roof, on the flat roof, you've got a balcony there, you've got a friend's house, and he's got children, I'm sure they'd love to help you build a debris shelter. I'm going to be building 7 different debris shelters, on one in each different night of the feast, and I'll keep you posted on each of them, and having good food and sharing it with other people. But the main emphasis is on worshiping the Lord, looking and thinking about God. Everything I have, that includes the peace of the world, that includes economic security, that includes health, that includes joy, that includes peace of mind, that includes just spending time with God. What does a father want more than for people to spend time with him? And, you know, people, the churches, they love to talk about their favorite word, tithe, but they never talk about another word, which is mentioned. Tithe is mentioned only twice in the New Testament. About the Jews, you tithe mint and cumin and anise and whatever. But the word Sabbath is mentioned dozens and dozens of times in the New Testament. Christ kept the Sabbath. God values us spending time with him. God's got money. He doesn't need your tithe. He needs your time. He needs you to spend time with him. He wants you, like a good father wants a child to come to him and spend time with him, not just buy him something and fob him off like that and think that that's what God wants. No, God wants your time. He wants your appreciation. And going to church for 1 hour on a Sunday just doesn't cut it. Thinking of God for that 1 hour and then getting on with your Sunday, mowing the lawn or sport or TV or whatever, it just doesn't cut it. So to devote time, throw time at God, and that's what he commands. That's what he wants. He's told us exactly how we can honor him and nullify this curse in Deuteronomy 28, verse 47. Because you serve not the Lord your God with joyfulness and with gladness of heart for the abundance of all things, therefore shall you serve your enemies, which the Lord shall send against you, hunger and in thirst and nakedness and in want of all things. And he shall put a yoke of iron upon your neck until he have destroyed you. I feel we are coming into a time where God has just let mankind run rampant long enough. And now I believe, and we'll have to see, I just feel that there has been a change in just the posture and attitude in the world, and that this has just become a much less friendly place. And I say the only way you're going to change that is to have God on your side, and God tells us how we can be on his side. So there we go. That's my take on the Feast of Debris Shelters.